In some ways, we don't take life seriously enough because we don't really understand it. What we do take too seriously are the unimportant things in life. We don't take the things which are really important at all seriously. We think, getting a better job, having more money in the bank, having a better partner, a fast car, bigger house, etc., 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 having recognition and status and being on the television and doing all these things, these are looked on as being vitally important things, whereas they aren't. They're not important at all. What is important is understanding who you as a person are and why you're here at this time. And although you can't come up with all the definitive answers, what you can say is that you are here for a particular purpose. Try and find that purpose and try and cooperate with that purpose, because that's the reason you've come into this life at this particular time.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 7 of That Death Show. Hello, Tim Wyatt. How are you?
I'm very well, Mrs. Ann Kelly, and surviving the start of the winter here in Yorkshire.
I know. I can't believe it's already Christmas almost. How did that happen? But it's good to be back with you. I think we might be getting the hang of things. What do you think here on That Death Show?
Well, I'm optimistic that we'll get over some of the technical problems that we've encountered so far. Certainly hope so.
It wouldn't be the same show if we didn't have drama beforehand. But since it is 21 shopping days left till Christmas, I think this would be the perfect gift for your loved one or perhaps for yourself. So we want to give away another copy of Everyone's Book of the Dead, written by our very own Tim Wyatt. And that is the gift of comfort and peace and understanding. And all you need to do, well, really quick, because the Tibetans have a Book of the Dead, the Egyptians have a Book of the Dead. Why don't you have a Book of the Dead or your loved one for Under the Tree this year? So if you comment or share or post or rate or review any activity on these podcasts, all of those names go into a hopper/a hat. And I will do a drawing, and we will not only give you this $20 value, of which is really priceless. This book is priceless, but we're also going to pay for postage. So good luck to you. And thank you for supporting us through our first few weeks as we get this off the ground. It is a very different experience for both of us. As Tim says, we are analog people, and there are some people listening right now that won't know what that means. What that means is back in the day, there was a stick that went up in the air, and we had reel-to-reels and vinyl, and we had razor blades, and we suited up and showed up, and we were there in the station around the clock, old school. This digital world is a very different place indeed. So we're finding our feet. And don't forget to check out Tim's most recent documentary and a film festival finalist. It's called The Myth of Death. You can watch it absolutely free right here on our YouTube channel, which is at That Death Show. So make sure you check that out. The most comforting film about death I have ever encountered, and pretty much the reason we're both sitting in these seats. So we hope to remove the fear and the mystery surrounding death. We want to offer comfort and hope. And remember, we're all eternal energy. Death is just a doorway to a brand new beginning, and death comes to each and every one of us. Through understanding death, we can learn the meaning of life. Now, last week we touched on death rites and funerary practices throughout history. Today, I'm very excited about this. We're going to go into invisible helpers, the roles of angels and deva spirits and nature spirits and fairies, and how they create and sustain and preserve life, and how they work on the embryo in utero, which is fascinating. Tim, I want to start off. Does everybody have a guardian angel?
Yes, in principle, yes,
Everybody?
they do. I've just read a very interesting book by an Irish author called Lorna Byrne. And she's written 2 or 3 books
Yes.
about angels, and she's observed these since she was a very young girl growing up in Ireland. I mean, she wrote these books and she can't even read and write properly herself, and they're absolutely fascinating. And she says quite clearly in this book, everyone has a guardian angel, whether they recognize that entity or not. It's there preserving, protecting, etc.
That is so comforting. I love that. And would these be the same thing as guides? Would the guardian angels and guides and all that, when we refer to spirit guides, be the same thing?
Well, the guardian angel, I think, has a number of different functions. And obviously, we've all had instances in our lives, I certainly have, and I'm sure you have, where we've come very close
Mm.
to physical death for one reason or another. And quite unexpected events have happened to protect us. But as well as that, these angels have a much wider function, and one of them is to convey messages and information and guidance to us.
I've heard that we have to ask for their help before they will intervene. Is that true in your understanding?
I believe it is. There has to be
Hmm.
an intention on your part. I mean, in esoteric circles, we say that energy follows thought. Everything starts on the mental plane and then gets actualized eventually on the physical plane. But we have to ask for that help. Although the angels may provide help when we don't ask for it, there's no reason at all why we can't cooperate with these beings because they're much wiser than we are and they have access to
Mm.
much more information than we do. So they can be a very useful tool as well as a source of protection and indeed comfort.
Hmm. The realm of angels, devas, as we call them in Theosophy in the perennial philosophy, I'm hoping you can explain this for us, is the hierarchy. And I'm trying to get my head around that as I understand. There is a hierarchy that they are bound to, which is a huge subject. Is it possible for you to share your understanding on that for us, please?
Well, if you have about 7 days, then I think we could probably brush over it in that time. But
Like,
yes, there are vast hierarchies of angels, or as you say, devas. Deva is a Sanskrit word which is usually translated as shining ones. And
mm,
angels, in one form or another, appear in every single religion, organized, tribal, in every way. They appear in all sorts of different guises. Now, you might have a guardian angel attached to one person. You might have an angel of place, like a hospital or a law court, or you might have one presiding over a city, over a particular part of a landscape, a larger angel covering an entire mountain range. There will be planetary angels, interplanetary angels, solar angels, etc., into hierarchies that we can't even yet begin to
mm.
understand. But certainly in the Christian terminology, they divide them into 9 different classes of angels, which all have different functions, which we won't go into. But every religion has its own particular classification for these things.
Like you said, we would need hours upon hours. Would you say for those who ask, were angels men, or will they be men or humans? Should I say?
Well, this is a difficult topic, but it's often said that the angels belong to a hierarchy which is beyond the human kingdom. It's a non physical kingdom. The angels largely have mental bodies, although it's said that they can possibly step down that into coarser rate of vibration and appear astrally. Of course, we can't see astrally either, most of us. But these angels do appear to people. I mean, there are many, many cases where, for example, in the First World War, thousands and thousands of soldiers on both sides saw an angel at the Battle of Mons. And this is not unusual. There have been numerous different occasions where this has happened in the past. So they belong to a superhuman kingdom. Many of them will have passed through the human kingdom, and it's said that humans are destined themselves to enter this kingdom or others which are superhuman at some point in the future.
Oh, I love that. It's just so it feels so good. It's almost like water to the fire of the soul. Rick Archer from Buddha at the Gas Pump, he shared a quote from one of his guests, and I'm going to have to paraphrase here. He said that angels are lovingly jealous, for lack of a better word, of humans being in the physical world because this is the ultimate opportunity for evolution. Where we are right now, we're between spirit and matter, and there is much trial and tribulation here, but this is where we get a chance to grow. What would you think about that quote?
Well, I think that's very accurate because principally angels are mental beings and they are about being and having an intellectual life rather than doing. Doing is something that humans do. And this is why angels might be jealous of the fact that we can do things physically, which they can't. Although they have immense powers, we can still do things that are beyond their scope because of the way that they are constructed.
And all these cultures, all through the millennia, all talking about the same thing, even though they were not talking with each other. There has to be something to this, to these angels, to these fairies, to these nature spirits and energies. And there's so much to talk about here. But of course, I'd like to touch on this one here is the fallen angel and the word name Lucifer, which you will hear thrown around in the theosophical circles, which everybody that I have encountered that is not inside or understanding misunderstands. And they immediately equate Lucifer with Satan. And that is not the case. This is the morning star. Can you share just a little bit about Lucifer, the fallen angel, please?
Well, Lucifer was part of a group of angels who rebelled against the hierarchy, and believing that they were right and they were expelled, etc., etc. Now, Lucifer means light, and yet the church over the years has conflated Lucifer with Satan, with some diabolic or
Mhm.
demonic presence, but that's far from the case. And this is why Madame Blavatsky, who started the Theosophical Society, she named one of her first magazines, very controversial at the time, she named it Lucifer because she wanted to bring this new knowledge that she'd acquired into the West, and she wanted a light bearer to do that. And that magazine called Lucifer was that light bearer.
I have to say that is really extremely brave for Victorian times. And even now, when I mention it in a video or if I talk about it in a little thing, I am absolutely annihilated by those who equate Lucifer with Satan. I want to really reiterate right here. Lucifer, the morning star, this is the bringer of light. Look up the definition, look it up in the Bible. You will see that Lucifer is not Satan. So there's much to cover there. And again, a very brave move by Blavatsky. And I think it's just, there's a little bit of playful cheek in that I absolutely love. And we were talking about, and you mentioned this to me a little bit in the last episode about the gestation period of the human being, and that life begins from conception, and that the helpers and the creators, is it the Lipica? What is happening inside the womb? How do the angels play a part, or these astral beings, these entities, these intelligences? How do they play a part in building the human being?
Well, before we deal with that, Anne, we need to just sidetrack for a moment, because alongside the angels, which belong to a particular superhuman kingdom, there are nature spirits or
Mm.
elementals, fairies, gnomes, sprites, trolls. They go by thousands of different names depending on the culture. These belong to three separate kingdoms known as the etheric kingdoms below the mineral kingdom. They have
Mm.
permanent astral bodies, but occasionally they can manifest in etheric form, so at the higher end of the physical spectrum. And these have been known throughout history. Sometimes they're looked on as mischievous, sometimes they can be destructive, sometimes they can be very helpful. But they are the agents of the angels. So we can regard the angels as the architects and the nature spirits as the builders or the doers who carry out the angels' orders. And yes, they
Mm.
cooperate together in many different ways. So a tree, for example, might have an angel, but it might have a number of nature spirits attached to that tree as well. So it's a
Mm.
very complex
It's
relationship.
Well, it's just so important. I'm sorry I got so excited there. It's just so important that this information gets out there. I know how I felt when I first read it, when I was first understanding it. If we just saw how everything works in harmony together, how this is all one big thing, we are all one big thing. And the nature spirits, that's how again, I always say this, how Christopher and I fell in love with you. My husband and I were watching your presentation on fairies, and we thought that guy has his finger on the pulse of something very important. He knows what he's talking about. So I know that when you say the mineral kingdom, under the mineral kingdom, because we go from mineral to vegetable to animal to human and then beyond. And then there is something underneath that. And you said also, we talked about how these elementals, so say we're out on a walk in nature. Everything has consciousness, correct? Because our Dr. V, Dr. Eddie Villamoria, often phrases it this way, that consciousness expresses itself as matter, not in matter. Everything is conscious, is it not?
Absolutely. And these members of these etheric kingdoms, the fairies, elves, gnomes, and all the other names that we give to them, they are basically prototype forms which will ultimately enter the different kingdoms above them at some point. So they have no physical form at the moment, but in the future may well have a physical form. And they operate basically, as we say, in conjunction with the angels. And they sustain all life. They not only sustain life, they help to create it, they help to preserve it. Without the angels, without the devas and the nature spirits, we and our fellow members of the other kingdoms, even stones, wouldn't exist because they are the
Mm.
preserving force. You asked me a little earlier on about how they work on creating a new human body. And this is an absolutely fascinating process. Um, about 100 years ago, there was a clairvoyant called Geoffrey Hodson, who I've studied very closely in recent weeks and months. He was a clairvoyant who grew up in Lancashire in England, and from an early age, he was able to see these things. And back in the 1920s, he observed a woman through 9 months of pregnancy and wrote this wonderful, wonderful book about it. And it describes how the embryo is impacted on astrally, physically, and mentally in different ways by different types of elementals, and in the later stages by presiding angel. And at the end, is an even more mighty presence. When the baby is about to be born, there is the emergence of this figure that Hodson described as the world mother, and she presides over this birth. But of course, the nature spirits and the angelic presences continue with the baby to help it survive through its first few weeks and to help it grow and develop. It's a truly fascinating process, all this. And I don't think I've ever come across anyone who has described it better than that. The book is called The Brotherhood of Angels and Men, and I think you can find it online.
Thank you. And remember, these teachings are ageless. They don't belong to anybody. No one owns them. You don't have to join anything. You don't have to pay anybody. They belong to everyone. It's called perennial philosophy, which just simply means it is eternal and evolving with mankind. These are instruction manuals for life. Tim, that is beautiful. So these are the invisible helpers. So right now, where we sit, everybody who's listening and watching, and you and I are surrounded by energies and intelligence, and I don't want to say entities, but we are surrounded right now.
Yeah, one way that you can observe these is not directly, because most people can't see them, but if you have animals in your house, particularly cats and dogs, they can see these things. My own cat, I often see her staring somewhere up into the corner of a room. And you look up there and you think, oh, she's looking at a spider crawling around or something like that. And there's nothing there. And yet she's locked onto it. And occasionally they just stare into the distance. And because they are built slightly different in a visual sense from us, their eyes are slightly different to ours. They can see things which we can't. And they are clearly aware of these things. Animals are often spooked by something that we cannot see. Horses, very sensitive animals, they're also spooked sometimes when you're riding one through the woods or something like that, and they sense something there which they don't like.
And there's tons of videos online right now about that, showing the animals their ability to see the other side. And also babies, when they first, I remember Alex, when he was born, he would look up and smile as if somebody was standing there, just look up and smile, the biggest smile. He'd look up into the corners. And I thought, am I imagining that? Because back then I was still a long way to go, but I did think he's obviously got people around him. He's got helpers or angels, I would think. And would you say when you were young, though, did you believe in angels from the get go?
Well, I think I probably did. I was brought up in a nominally Christian household and went to Sunday school and church where we were told that these things existed. But whether they were angels or not, when I was out in the countryside, particularly with in the remote woods and fields near where we lived with my parents, I'd sense things then from quite an early age, from the age of about 5 or 6. I sensed that these things were actually real. But then, of course, as you grow up and you become a teenager, these ideas become somewhat unfashionable, and so you don't really talk about them too much. Indeed, these things are very difficult to talk about because a lot of people think all talk of invisible kingdoms is just down to some sort of psychopathology or mental illness or whatever.
Well, that's true, but at least we're talking about it, and there are more people that are talking about it. And it was really the UK, when I first moved to the UK 15 years ago, was the first time I ever met people who emphatically said, I have absolutely seen a fairy. Because in California, I'd never met anyone that would be one, brave enough to say that out loud, or two, that actually did see them. So I know that there were people that described being out in the woods and seeing a shape of a face take place upon a mossy rock or something like that, and they said, see, that's the fairies, and I'm thinking that's the elementals. And it was it was mind-blowing, really, to understand that. But everything is conscious, as we mentioned, and fairies are very, very real. And so we think about leprechauns and all that through the millennia. They're talking about these, you mentioned trolls even. So the role of these elementals, I also remember in one of your talks and through the teachings, that they feed on the emotions and the thoughts of humanity. Can you expand some on that, how thoughts play a role with elementals?
Well, it's said that some classifications of elementals or fairies are very hostile to human beings. Not necessarily hostile, but they don't like our coarse emotional vibrations and find them very, very disturbing sometimes. And certainly the British Isles is replete with stories about angels, but also fairy folk of one sort or another. But of course, over the last 250 years since the Industrial Revolution, and more people have moved away from the country into towns and cities, and the more there has been industrialization and mechanization, people have become further divorced from the land. And so this regular contact which people used to have with these nature spirits has been severed. Country folk in the past tried to do their best to please these spirits because they knew that they were responsible for the health of themselves, their animals, their crops failing or succeeding, and many other things about their daily lives. So they held them in great respect. And sometimes there was an element of fear associated with them because they were said to abduct children or abduct people
Mm.
in their fairy mounds. And then people would emerge in what they thought was a couple of days' time, and 100 years would have elapsed, you know. So there is all this kind of stuff which has now largely vanished. And so the notion of fairies or pixies or gnomes or elves or all the other things, certainly in the West, is very unfashionable and would be looked on as being ludicrous, frankly. But in India, they still have 330 million different nature spirits, and they're quite happy with it.
Yes, they do. They do. And I was going to say, as you're talking about this is a question from a viewer, is that churchianity or religion has often taken over these ancient beliefs and then they label them with their own, like absolutely demon or angel. And then we're thinking about like the witch trials. And wouldn't you think that possibly what was happening with these gentle, innocent people that we murdered out of ignorance, possibly they were working with nature spirits and elementals?
Absolutely. And these were principally healers, herbalists, shamanic type people, wise women who also knew which herbs cured which disease, who helped with childbirth. These were the sustainers of those communities. These women helped to ensure that children came into the world. They helped to ensure that people could be healed using the local herbs and medicines available. And yet, they were portrayed as being, well, agents of the devil and therefore had to be
Mm.
burned at the stake. Absolutely terrible, terrible. Well, almost genocide, because we're not talking about a few here. If you take America and Europe into account, you're talking about many hundreds of thousands of principally women, but some men as well. Throw in with that the Inquisition, another few tens or hundreds of thousands of people. And this religion of love suddenly turns into something else entirely, doesn't it?
It's still going on. It's still going. Ignorance and greed and control. I just am baffled by how cruel we can be to one another. When I mean, hopefully we're learning. There are many people that are turning to look at nature. Nature is church, in our teachings in the perennial philosophy. It says nature is the church. We are the temple. In the pagan teachings, you can see a lot of people on TikTok talking about that, returning to nature. That's what we need to do. The buildings are beautiful, but they should stay buildings, and we need to. It's the religions. I get really fired up about that, about being freedom from religion and going back to what we need to be, which is working in harmony with nature, and just understanding. That's one of the reasons we do this podcast, is to get these out there so you can have access to them, and they're available online for free everywhere if you just look. And another question here is, people are wondering, how can you tell if your angel is close to you or interacting with you? I mean, obviously they're hanging around, they're close, but I don't know how time and space works in that way. But how can you tell? Is it tinnitus? Is it a light flash? How do you know that there is interaction taking place?
Well, I think it depends largely on the degree of sensitivity that a particular individual has, and also, crucially, the development of a principle higher than that of mind, which we call the wisdom intuition principle. This is something which bypasses the mind. It's very much part of the higher mind, and it conveys information to us which is not filtered through the brain or through the mental process. And this is quite mysterious to a lot of people. But this intuitive faculty is something that more and more people are being born with. It's where you have this innate and complete understanding that something is true. It's an absolute certainty. In its crudest form, it might manifest as things like gut instincts or hunches and that sort of thing. But it's the intuition principle which has helped people like Tesla and Einstein and Da Vinci and every other great creator and thinker throughout history. Often they get these ideas when they're not even thinking about them, when they're daydreaming or go into some slightly altered state. That's when the answers come to them, not when they're sitting at their desk doing loads of equations or whatever.
And the information is coming from the universal consciousness. So, in a way, everything is channeled. Does that make sense? I've said that before and people attack me for it, but I believe that that's the truth.
Well, it is, because there is a universal consciousness, and consciousness is not locked inside this 1,500 cc's of grey matter stuck in our heads. Consciousness goes far beyond that, and Dr. B and I and you and many others are doing our best to uh, thump the tubs and try and persuade people that this is the case. But materialistic science says no, 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 no. Without a brain, there can be no consciousness. And yet, as we've discussed in previous podcasts, this is perfectly possible. And people have these out of the body experiences when they're injured or when they're having operations, etc., etc. So using that wisdom intuition principle is the best way to contact this higher element surrounding you, this angelic presence around you. If you are not attuned to that at all, then it becomes very, very difficult. And it's only by not thinking logically about it that you're liable to have any contact, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense, dear. It does. And the number one video on this channel is one about how to get psychic powers, because people want them right away, and they usually want them for selfish purposes. In my understanding and my experience, is that they must be earned. Everybody has these astral abilities. Everyone, clairvoyance, clairaudience, everybody has them. But you must. It's the work within. You need to work on yourself. That's the whole point of any of these teachings, is to overcome your lower self and access the higher self, or if you want to call that your soul, which we're going to be covering in the next episode. But it's you can earn them, and some people, they're very sharp and they use them for nefarious reasons, or they use them for good. But they are here for us to use for good, for the best interest of all beings on our planet. I was going to say, this whole thing, the name of this show is called That Death Show, but it's really understanding life and death, because death is such a sacred thing. It is beautiful and it is natural. It is not a tragedy. It is nothing to be afraid of. By understanding that you are surrounded by these beautiful beings who have your best interest at heart. And you are protected, and all is going to be okay. And then, in a way, this illusion will pass, and you'll look back at it and you'll say, oh, I learned from it, but it's nowhere near. Do you think we take life too seriously? Is it as serious as we think it is, Tim?
Well, in some ways, we don't take life seriously enough because we don't really understand it. What we do take too seriously are the unimportant things in life. We don't take the things which are really important at all seriously. We think, getting a better job, having more money in the bank, having a better partner, a faster car, bigger house, etc., 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 having recognition and status and being on the television and doing all these things, these are looked on as being vitally important things, whereas they aren't. They're not important at all. What is important is understanding who you as a person are and why you're here at this time. And although you can't come up with all the definitive answers, what you can say is that you are here for a particular purpose. Try and find that purpose and try and cooperate with that purpose, because that's the reason you've come into this life at this particular time.
I do not know if I could say it better ever. That is a perfect soundbite again. That is absolutely brilliant. Thank you for that. The near death experiencers are coming back and they are absolutely saying that. They're validating that the wealth and fame and status and all of that doesn't mean anything. It's the small things. It's about the kindness and compassion that you showed to other human beings, how you overcame difficulties in your life, not what happened to you, but how you handled it, how you grew, and that all the stuff that we hold up in high regard is literally just fodder. It's like a little facade fodder. It doesn't matter. So all these things you think, oh, they're so famous, they have all that. It doesn't make, you can't take it with you. There's a reason that there's that saying. And I was going to share with you, I can't find the woman's name who said this. It's a quote on grief. And that's one of the reasons we do the show too, is to help with grief. Because if you understand all of this, death isn't sad or scary. It gets much less sad and scary. She writes, grief is like a bloodied hand wrapped tightly around the thorns when told to focus on the roses. And I was thinking, oh, this is how, I mean, I used to feel that way. But in understanding what we talk about on this show and in the perennial philosophy, I don't feel that way anymore. I see it as a graduation and a good thing. What are your thoughts on a quote like that about people that the suffering? It is an ending, it is a loss, but it isn't forever. What would your thoughts be, Tim?
Some people do suffer from grief in a way that it's difficult for other people to imagine. Some people's
Mm,
lives are completely reshaped by the loss of a loved
mhm.
one, be it their parents or their spouse or a child or whatever. Some people are never able to overcome it. And there are people, I've met people like this, who literally die of a broken heart. And so you can't
Yes.
underestimate that. Uh, if they don't die physically, they die kind of psychically and inwardly. Their spirit and soul becomes enclosed in concrete, or it becomes suffocated in some way. But nevertheless, grief is something that ultimately we do have to overcome, because it is powerful and it can destroy us. And perhaps what we should do is say that whatever time we spent with those people we're grieving for, that time can be never taken away for us. It's still embedded in our memories. So those people will permanently be there in our memories, if not physically. But of course, because we live in a universe which is physically dominated, where the material plane dominates our consciousness, if somebody's not there and they are dead,
Mm,
then that is a source of sadness. The
mm.
Druids used to sometimes weep at the birth of a baby and celebrate at death, because people knew they were going off to somewhere that was rather better than the physical plane.
They're going home. Yes, and I mean no disrespect for those. Some people find my approach callous. I don't mean to appear that way. Everybody has a different journey. Everybody's experience is unique. And I do understand. So I don't mean it as dismissive of everything's so great, the roses, da da da. It's just through understanding what we talk about on this show, in these teachings, I have found great comfort. And I just wish to share that. So, oh, it's beautiful. Thank you so much. Through understanding death, we can learn the meaning of life. And you don't have to have a near death experience to earn the wisdom gained there. You don't have to. That's the whole point of this podcast, That Death Show. We wish to remove the mystery and the fear, the unnecessary fear, and sharing these ageless teachings. This is just a literal instruction manual for living. Do you have any final thoughts, Tim, before we close?
One of the reasons I got into all this is because I don't like to see people frightened about death. And do people think, apart from if you're a vegan living in California or something, that you're going to live forever? You're not going to live forever. And people need to understand that it's about a rhythm. And this idea that we can somehow, using technology, using medical techniques or whatever, preserve our physical lives indefinitely, strikes me as being a real sad symptom of the times that we live in, because we've lost touch with the natural rhythms of life and death. And it's those natural rhythms that we need to reconnect with.
Perfectly said. Thank you so much.
Sorry about the
Did
rest
you
of
see?
vegans and Californians, but
I was just thinking that. I go, well, yeah, that's okay. But I don't want to live forever. I absolutely don't want to live forever. As a matter of fact, my birthday, I just had my birthday recently and I thought, okay, 58. Let's see. It's only my lifespan. I'm getting up there. I am not afraid of death at all. The method of death, as we talked about, many people are afraid of the method of death and the pain that takes place when you leave the physical body. But death itself, I am not afraid at all. But no, I know there are some vegans who want to preserve their life and remain here forever, but you got to get your work done and you got to return too. You need a little break in between to keep coming back. Keep on coming back. So please don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, rate, review, and share. Remember, those that do so this week will be entered to win everyone's Book of the Dead. The Tibetans have one. The Egyptians have one. Tim has written one just for you. This is a 20-pound value. We'll pay for shipping. Just make sure that if you'd like to buy a copy, you head over to firewheelbooks.co.uk. And remember that there is nothing to be afraid of. Death is not a tragedy. It is not permanent. It is not final. It is not fatal. These are Tim's words. And do take a look at The Myth of Death. And we want to thank the Blavatsky Trust as well for funding a lot of your work, Tim, and also part of this podcast because you're working on another project. You never put your feet up. Thank you to the Blavatsky Trust for their support as well. The Myth of Death, you can watch it right here on our YouTube channel at That Death Show. Thank you very much for being with us. And 21 days until Christmas. We will be back next week. Next week, we have a new show for you. We're going to be taking a look at the soul. What is the soul? And when I'm watching these cheesy old movies where they say, oh, I sold my soul to the devil, I don't think you could do that, can you, Tim?
no, I think that's
Can't sell it.
A forbidden transaction, basically.
But what is the soul? We're going to cover that next week here on That Death Show. Thank you so much for being here, Tim. I love you, everybody. I'll see you next week.
Bye, everybody.
Death comes to us all, but death is not a tragedy. Everyone's Book of the Dead by Tim Wyatt reveals a whole new perspective on what lies beyond this earthly life. The Egyptians have a Book of the Dead. The Tibetans have a Book of the Dead. Shouldn't you have one too? This captivating, richly illustrated book explores the mystery of death by examining it from every angle, sharing the ageless esoteric teachings on karma, reincarnation, and after-death states, as well as examining death and dying in different cultures, religions, and spiritual traditions. Death is not fatal, final, or permanent, but simply a transitional doorway to a new beginning. Get your copy of Everyone's Book of the Dead today at firewheelbooks.co.uk.